Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. Now, before I begin, what I want you to do is think very carefully about who you think is responsible for cybersecurity in your organisation, and we'll come back to that. Now, if you think about cybersecurity and cyber resilience, we need to think about our employees. Now, our employees, the users of our information systems, are our biggest threat, the absolute biggest threat. This is clear in the research. However, they're also our biggest asset, and this is something that we need to develop. We need to think about how we can develop our employees so they're our biggest asset in terms of developing cyber resilience. Now, we know, for example, at the moment, and some of you might be doing this today, that we've been working from home. It's been a huge mandated working from home situation over the previous few months, and because of COVID-19, of course, right across the world, and that's introduced all sorts of security threats that we haven't had to deal with before. So what I'm going to do today is talk about cyber resilience in terms of employees and resilience and cyber culture. So let's think about the biggest obstacles when it comes to cybersecurity. And when you have a look at each of these on the screen, on my slides right now, you will see the very first one is lack of skilled personnel. So the lack of skilled personnel often refers to technical people, and we know there is a huge issue in terms of enough cyber trained people from a technology perspective, but we also need skilled personnel from a cyber governance perspective, for example, and other cyber roles. They're not all technology roles that we need to be thinking about here. There's low security among employees. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation today. Much too much data to analyze because we have so much of it, and poor or insufficient automation of threat detection. And that is often a combination of technology and, of course, people. So just to set the scene a little bit more, let's think about the context of what we're dealing with at the moment. All of us across the world when it comes to cyber threats. And you will see just recently, I saw in the news this morning, for example, that, and over the last few days, that there have been state actors that have been looking to hack the virus vaccination trials, those sorts of things. So the malicious actors are always ahead of us. So the first thing, of course, is malware. And malware can be a combination of different things. They can be viruses, they can be phishing and spear attacks, they can be account takeover credentials, other things here. But these other three things are more specific. So the first one is phishing attacks. And most of us know about a phishing attack, and that's a general email, for example, that will go out to lots of people with the malicious actors hoping that somebody will click the link. But spear phishing is different. It's targeted at you specifically. So it's an individualized social engineering attack. And that can look really genuine. And that is what happens often. If employees receive an email with a link and it looks like it comes from an authentic source like their boss, then they're more likely to click on the link. So it's much more targeted. The other one that is particularly prevalent right at the moment is ransomware. So if we just look at the Australian example, recently with Toll, not only were they attacked once, which caused significant financial damage, but not only financial damage, of course, but it caused significant damage in terms of their ability to do what they needed to do. So their customer service, their ability to deliver parcels, all of those sorts of things, their whole supply chain was interrupted. So they were attacked, but then they were attacked for a second time. Now, the issue with ransomware right at the moment is that some organizations are choosing to pay the ransom. They're making a commercial decision to do this, and that is problematic, I think, but we won't go into that today. The other key area that we need to be thinking about is the account takeover credential abuse attacks. And this is when people, malicious actors have stolen people's credentials. So for example, passwords. I'm going to talk a bit about passwords today as an example. So passwords. So being able to find passwords, say on the dark web, and then use those passwords to try to get into other people's accounts, because often people use the same password in multiple accounts. So as you can see, what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with issues from malicious actors that are always going to be a step ahead of us. That is the point here. They're always going to be a step ahead of us. And then what we're going to have to do is work out what it is that they're wanting. Is it information? Is it financial? Whatever it is, and then put in place some ways to counteract that. And that's why we need to think about cyber resilience. How are we going to build cyber resilience in our employees and our organizations in order to deal with this? So let's think about some of these emerging threats. So not just COVID-19, as I talked about earlier. COVID-19 is particularly problematic with working from home because people are using more cloud-based apps. So for example, Dropbox and iCloud. And of course, malicious actors know that. So they're likely to decide that, you know, this might be a good thing to attack. So this working from home and cloud storage was a problem before, but it's more prevalent now with COVID-19. And going forward, we're going to have more of this working from anywhere. So we're going to be seeing that people are going to be relying more on cloud-based apps. Spear phishing, as I explained before, is a social engineering attack. It's really targeted at you personally. Ransomware, problematic in terms of some organizations now, because they're paying the ransomware and they have to disclose it because of privacy regulations, for example, that is becoming something that malicious actors are more likely to try their hand at. And the other really important point to note here is large organizations have a lot of resources in order to deal with cyber security, cyber risk. But small and medium businesses, not so much. Sometimes it's not even on their radar because they're too busy dealing with other problems that they have to deal with and operational problems. But this is a problem from large organizations, from government departments, because these small and medium organizations are part of the supply chain. So if they are attacked, this is a way to tunnel in. This is a way to get into other larger organizations. So these are the threats that are going to be things that we're going to have to deal with going forward. And we have to think about how our employees, our biggest asset here, are going to help us to be able to deal with that. So what I wanted to do was just to show you a couple of diagrams here. So if you have a look at this first diagram on this slide, you will see across the top here, you can see all the different types of applications, the infrastructure, supply chain, all across that axis across the top there. So you can see that we have the infrastructure, like the routers, like the, we have VPNs, we have the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things is really important, particularly in supply chains, because they provide lots of opportunities for organizations and cloud, but they also provide huge risks, of course. So when you have a look at the other axis and you look at the things that can actually go wrong, you will see top of that list there is a couple of things relating to passwords. So the first is weak passwords, the second is shared passwords. So if I just take those as examples, we could look at all the other issues, all the other things that could go wrong. But if you have a look at that matrix there, you can see that potentially we have 750 apps, 1,500 users, and 1 million shared passwords for attack. So what is this doing? This is providing a much bigger attack surface than we've ever seen before. And this is creating more risk in organizations. So once again, we have to think about how we deal with this. So our employees are a big part of building this cybersecurity culture and this ability to deal with these risks. So when we have a look at the next slide, we can see that this is a heat map. It is not possible for an organization to protect against every possible thing. And you will see in the literature, often the literature talks about crown jewels. So organisations have to think about, how do we protect our crown jewels? What is the most important data that we have to protect? From a compliance perspective, from a customer service perspective, from a reputational perspective. So what are the things that we have to protect? And this matrix is really interesting because it shows you where you need to spend your resources, where you need to spend your time, where you need to spend your energy on making sure that your crown jewels are protected. So how do we do that? So how do we start thinking about how we deal with all of these things? So this is a model that shows how cybersecurity might be able to be built in an organisation. So the first thing we need to think about is external influences. So an organisation, it doesn't matter if you're a sole business, a small organisation, a government department, a large organisation. We don't operate just in our organisation. We operate in a context. We operate in a social environment. So the first thing we need to be thinking about is the external influences. So if we think about what other organisations are doing, the societal cybersecurity culture, and we can see in Australia what's happening here is that the government have made noises, they've made policy decisions about spending more money on cybersecurity to protect our infrastructure. So that is a good thing. So it shows that the government is really thinking a bit more clearly or closely about putting some resources into this space. Maybe not enough, maybe not in the right way, we don't know, but it's on the radar. External rules and regulations. So we know that we have the privacy regulations here in Australia. And why is that important? It's important because data breaches have to be reported now for the most part. And we have GDPR, which is a general data protection regulation in the EU. And that is important because it's got very strict regulations around how you protect customer data. So any organisation around the world that deals with EU customers has to abide by that. And peer institutions. So what else is happening in your organisation, in your industry organisations? So the organisational mechanisms here. So things like culture, leadership. So when we think about cybersecurity and we think of cybersecurity risk, often we think about, well, it starts at the board level, right? So we start at the board level and then senior managers, and then it should, then we should have an organisation that is thinking about cyber risk and cybersecurity culture. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. I don't know that that's necessarily happening. We need to communicate. We need to think about rewards and punishments, performance evaluation, cybersecurity training. Now, with cybersecurity training, this can be a little bit of an issue because often organisations think about cybersecurity training in terms of compliance. Now, compliance is important, of course, but cybersecurity training doesn't always lead to better behaviour or appropriate behaviour. So just thinking about the research side of things for a moment, I have a research student that is looking at employee behaviour, employee cybersecurity behaviour. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because what she did is she looked at behaviour, intention and behaviour. So we know that if somebody intends to behave a certain way, it is a predictor of behaviour, but that's not necessarily the case when it comes to cyber behaviour. So we need to think about organisational learning as well. So when a breach happens, how do we deal with that? And that's part of resilience. What do we do next? So in the organisation itself, we have cybersecurity beliefs, values and attitudes. So top management knowledge, I'll point out here, is particularly important, and that isn't always the case. Interdepartment collaboration, general cyber threat awareness. So often that is done via things like the IT department trying to test employees to see if they will click on a particular link, for example. So you have to be a little bit careful about that, because then you have to think about, well, if they do that, what happens? So you can see here that there's a number of things in an organization that we have to be thinking about in terms of beliefs, values, and attitudes. And there's two types of behavior. So in an organization, you have your own role. So I have my job and the sort of behavior when I'm doing my job, when I'm at home and I'm thinking about making sure I've got my virtual private network on, that my security patches are up to date, all of those sorts of things are happening. So that's my job, thinking about those sorts of things. But we also have other roles in an organization that aren't related to our job. And what they can do, those extra roles might also contribute to cybersecurity behavior. So these things when we're helping somebody else. So that might be if I help somebody else because I can't do something, I might share my password, that sort of thing. So what I want to do now is just talk about this slide, which is about cyber resilience. Now we need to tailor this for every single organization. So every organization is going to be slightly different. So the first thing we need to think about is what I call cyber hygiene. And the reason why I call it cyber hygiene is because even though I'm talking about employees and cyber behavior, cyber culture, the cyber hygiene things, the technology things really, really need to be there. So things like regulations and standards, things like governance frameworks, for example, NIST, the NIST framework, COBIT 2019. So anyone that's involved from a technology perspective that has a technology background will understand what those frameworks are. So you don't have to go and reinvent anything. Those best practice frameworks are out there. Things like virtual private networks that I mentioned earlier. So regardless of where people are working, if they're working at home, they're working in an office, we need to think about that security. Security should be designed into systems. We need to have the right policies and we need those trained technical people. So these things are critical, important. Cyber hygiene, baseline needs to be there. The next is the cyber culture that I talked about before. And the additional thing here I've got is the ethical perspectives relating to emerging technology adoption and cyber risk. As I said earlier, we're evolving, things are moving. So we need to try and be a step ahead, but we're not. The malicious actors are always a step ahead of us. So cyber behavior, intention does not always translate to behavior, as I said earlier. So we need to be aware of that. The other thing we need to be aware of, there's always a trade-off between security and usability. So if I come to work and I need to do my job, okay, and I'm in the office, I'm in my office today, I'm not thinking about security. I'm not thinking about that. I come to work and I need to check my emails, I need to do my work. I'm not thinking about security. But if I had to think a lot about security and then I couldn't use whatever it is I needed to use in order to get my job done, maybe I would need to find some workarounds, and that introduces risk, cyber risk. Now, the simple thing about passwords that I talked about earlier is there's some of these things are quite straightforward and simple. The human things like changing passwords and not using the same password. And forcing these password changes. So passwords should be changed regularly. Application controls, a single sign-on. A lot of organizations have this, and we need to enforce these cybersecurity policies. So how do we build resilience then? How do we build resilience? We need to embed positive cybersecurity behaviors into each of us. Each of us need to do that. And we need to model those behaviors. So we don't leave passwords sitting on sticky notes. We don't share our passwords. We don't do those sorts of things. The other thing we need to be aware of is that we need just-in-time awareness training. So it's not just about training and compliance, it's about thinking about awareness. So this has been going on. We've had ransomware attacks. There's all sorts of attacks happening all the time in the news, in the media, almost every day. Well, every day, actually. We need to allocate sufficient resources, and cyber is everyone's responsibility, absolutely. So, in summary, how do we deal with the biggest threat and the biggest asset in protecting an organisation from cyber attacks? and it's the human elements that's key here. So we need to build that cybersecurity culture regardless of the size or type of organisation. And as I said earlier, my research student found that habit was particularly important. So building cybersecurity habits, you know, you build an exercise habit, you make sure you have a sleep habit, whatever that is. So building cyber habits is really important. The other point I'd like to make too here in summing up is that this is a complex and not a set and forget activity. It's building that cyber awareness, and we need to be clear that this cyber awareness doesn't necessarily translate to appropriate cybersecurity behaviour. So what do? We need to make sure that the messaging is simple and easy to use, and that people understand what it means for them. And make it positive. This is a positive thing. This is not a negative thing. This is a positive thing in order to protect our data and information. Thank you. Now I'll hand over to my colleague Suzanne for Q&A.
Thanks very much, Yvette, and good morning, everyone. So Yvette, how do we know if we have the right cyber culture in our organisation?
If everybody understands what cybersecurity really means for them. So when we think about cybersecurity and we think about organisations, and you think about going to a meeting, it's not usually on the agenda. I don't think I've ever been to a meeting where cyber risk or cybersecurity was on the agenda. So cyber resilient organisation is where every employee knows where they fit in an organisation, they know what to do, and then when a data breach happens, they know what to do, and the organisation is able to learn from that.
So what are the key things that make an organisation cyber resilient?
An awareness of their cyber risk is very important, and every organisation is going to be different. So, and every team is going to be different. So understanding the cyber risk, making sure the employees have that awareness, and building those habits that I talked about earlier is really important. So people understand what is not normal.
Thanks, Yvette. So you mentioned testing earlier. Are there ways in which we can test resilience in an organisation, and what are they?
Yes, a lot of organisations do penetration testing. So what they do is they're out there, and what they do is they try and test employees to see if they'll fall for a scam email, for example, those sorts of things. And a lot of the testing is often done in a fairly, I would say, superficial way. So there's training, and then there's, then you have to answer some questions, those sorts of things, to say what you would do. And they're usually quite straightforward. It's quite easy to figure out what it is you would do, but that doesn't mean that that employee would then go ahead and do that.
Right. Okay, so if employees are the weakest link in cybersecurity and it affects everybody, where does the message come from in regard to security awareness? Is it from the CEO or HR or the IT manager?
That is a very, very good question. And the reason why is because often what happens is people just assume that it's all the IT people's problem. And IT have a very important part to play, as I said earlier. They have to be there. But it really needs to come from the team leader, from the manager of the team, because each team is going to be different. And what happens in organisations, and I have been guilty of this myself, sometimes you get so many emails from senior managers or from HR or whatever, you might skim it and delete it. You don't really take much notice of it. Whereas if it comes from your immediate manager and it means something to you and to your work, then that's going to mean something. So if you've got a department meeting, for example, and it's on the agenda, that's going to be more meaningful than coming from a senior manager from somewhere.
Great, thanks, Yvette. So how important are governance frameworks and technology in building cyber resilience?
They're very important because they're best practice. So what's happened with the NIST framework, for example, is that it was originally designed in the US for the US government. But since then, there's been a lot of industry feedback, government feedback, and it's used all around the world now. and it's designed so you can take the components that you need for your organization and adopt them, implement them, and it's best practice. So these frameworks are really important, and this helps with setting the risk appetite and looking at how you can develop a cyber risk profile and develop a way of dealing with these cyber risks.
And our last question for today is, if there's one thing to do after this webinar to help build cyber resilience, what would it be?
The most important thing is go and change your password.
I thought you might say that, actually.
You need to change your password, and you need to think about building those habits, all right? So once you can't be thinking about cybersecurity all the time. You have to make sure that you encourage those habits. So having those policies, once again, a lot of people don't read those, but if in your team you know what it means for you and the sorts of things that you have to do, like changing your passwords, making sure that that the sort of apps that you're accessing on your phone are safe, those sorts of things, they're all little things that can protect you.
Okay, wonderful. So no other comments about TikTok, perhaps?
Well, I saw, yes, well, this is it, isn't it? It's social media, TikTok, and I saw that there were big ads in the press on the weekend saying, we never give any of our data to the Chinese government, so TikTok is safe to use. So we're having to make decisions about our personal data all the time, but our obligation in organisations is to make sure that we're protecting our customer data.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Yvette. That's all we've got time for questions today. I'm going to hand back to Tony to close out. Thank you.
Macquarie Business School offers a number of short courses covering the whole range of management disciplines. And if you're interested in investigating any of these, our contact details are showing on the screen now. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Thank you again to Yvette, and encourage you all to keep your eyes out for future courses and webinars offered by Macquarie Business School. Thank you.